thank you for the opportunity to present my thesis. I don't want to talk about the organization of the General Staff, but about the influence of intelligence for decision-making. So due to the narrow time frame, let me start. In July and August 1940, the Prussian General Staff received a great deal of intelligence information about the armies of France, Russia, Great Britain, Belgium, Austria-Hungary, and Serbia. Were the Entente powers mobilizing for war against the dual alliance? Was an armed conflict imminent? Chief of General Staff Helmut von Moltke was convinced of this. To the Bavarian envoy Hugo von Lerchenfeld, he claimed to know, I quote, most definitely that a war of aggression against Germany had been decided upon and was being prepared between Russia, France, and England for 1917. A few weeks later, at the height of the Battle of the Marne, Moltke reviewed the events of the war so far. I quote, what rivers of blood have already flowed, what nameless misery has come over the innumerable innocents whose homes and farms have been burned and devastated. I am often overcome with horror when I think of it, and I feel as if I must take responsibility for this terrible thing, and yet I could not do otherwise than what has happened. Did the Prussian General Staff and its chief feel tempted, even forced, to go to war by intelligence information? This short presentation will shed light on how the Prussian General Staff dealt with intelligence and how significant it was for its decision-making. As we have already heard from Markus Pöllmann, the General Staff was not only responsible for German deployment and war planning, but also for collecting and evaluating information about foreign armies. Since the Chief of the General Staff acted as the first military advisor to the Emperor and the Imperial Chancellor, a look will also be taken at the transfer of intelligence to the German political leadership. The years between 1911 and 1914 have been chosen as a time period since the foreign policy tensions that repeatedly arose at this time led to an increase in the importance of military intelligence. The General Staff used intelligence for three things. Firstly, for the coordination of the German war and deployment plan with the actions of the presumed opponents. The information thus were transferred to its own second department and its railway department, which were responsible for deployment and war planning. Secondly, the General Staff needed information in order to coordinate the tactical procedures of the German army and the German war armament with the actions of the presumed opponents. Therefore, the information also went to the General Staff's own Sixth Department and other military institutions, such as the Prussian War Ministry. Finally, the intelligence also served to coordinate German foreign, military, and security policy with actions of the presumed adversaries. The General Staff therefore passed on its information to the political leadership around the Emperor, the Chancellor, and the Foreign Office. This usually was done by extensive memoranda or up-to-date compilations, but also by personal meetings between the Chief of General Staff and the Chancellor, or the Emperor. Yeah, you can see examples for General Staff memoranda passed on to other institutions. And please take a look on the left picture. There you can see the numerous addressees of the memoranda. The Prussian General Staff was the main provider of information on foreign armies. There was seldom any opposition from within the ranks of German politics. However, conflicting reports on the intentions of presumed opponents sometimes reached political leadership through German ambassadors. This concerned above all the assessments of Britain's political and military intentions. The General Staff informed the government about military developments abroad when necessary, especially in times of international crisis. During the Russian Revolution, during the Second Moroccan Crisis, or during the Balkan Wars, the Chief of General Staff even reported several times within a few weeks on the military political situation in France and Russia and also Great Britain. The political leadership relied on information from the General Staff and built its risky foreign policy on it. Knowing that the German army was militarily superior to the armies of France and Russia, the German government was able to pursue an unyielding course during the First Moroccan Crisis and the Bosnian Crisis. Political leadership unreservedly respected the General Staff competence in questions of security policy and accepted its analysis mostly uncritically. After all, the German government also regarded military power as the most essential means of increasing its own influence. But after 1909, the German military situation worsened visibly. On the one hand, Great Britain was leaning more and more towards the enemy camp, and on the other hand, France and Russia began extensive armaments with which the German Reich could not keep up from a quantitative point of view. The General Staff Military Intelligence was fully informed about these measures and had gathered a lot of information about them. Consequently, concerns about the future grew. As political tensions rose, the General Staff tried to use intelligence information to persuade the political leadership to wage a preemptive war. Until 1914, the General Staff bombarded the politicians with memoranda on French and Russian armaments that painting the growing threat in glaring colors. At the beginning of 1914, Moltke sent his deputy, Georg von Waldersee, to the Foreign Office to explain the military political situation that threatened the German Empire. The Chief of General Staff wanted to convince the political leadership of a change in German foreign policy. Doubts about the feasibility of the Schlieffen Plan and the growing strength of the opposing armies made it seem advisable to consider new alliances. In view of the successful rapprochement efforts with Great Britain, however, the political leadership around Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg was confident that it would be possible to prevent a European war between the great powers. But the General Staff did not let up. In May 1914, in a comprehensive analysis of the German military political situation, Waldersee called for further army reinforcements in view of the enemy's armament measures. However, if the German military forces were not strengthened, the German government would have to revise its foreign policy. The acting statesmen would have to realize that, I quote, the continuation of their policies only possible with success if the army is put in a position to defend itself to a certain extent against the enormous superiority. With this, the General Staff literally held a gun to the government's head. Due to the increasing armaments of France, Russia, but also Belgium, and the intelligence information received about them, high-ranking General Staff officers literally felt compelled to go to war. Although an enemy attack was not yet expected in 1914, it was considered likely after the completion of the Russian and French army reforms in 1917. Particularly in the July crisis, Moltke repeatedly invoked intelligence information on the presumed enemy to justify his insistence on war. Whereas politicians had previously been able to block the demands, they now relented and agreed to war. Residual doubts remained, however. The German ambassador in London, Karl Max von Lichnowsky, wrote to the Foreign Office, I quote, "As long as I can remember it, as long as I have been in contact with diplomacy, and that is now almost 30 years, I can remember that it was said that Russia was not ready, but would be ready in a few years, and that the General Staff was worried. And it was always not ready when those years approached, and so it will probably be in the future." But Bethmann-Hollweg had long since taken the General Staff's course and believed its intelligence information. I came to the conclusion, intelligence played a major role within the General Staff. It was not only necessary for the institution's own activities, but also enabled the General Staff to influence German foreign policy. With its monopoly in the field of military intelligence on foreign armies, the German General Staff consequently had a powerful instrument at its disposal. In the end, however, the General Staff's leadership was itself blinded by the information and felt compelled to go to war due to France's and Russia's increasing military efforts. What becomes clear is a lack of coordination between the political and military leadership, since the General Staff looked one-sidedly at military developments, but not at the political intentions of the foreign states. Thus, military intelligence contributed significantly to Moltke's push for a violent solution to the crisis. Certainly, the Chief of General Staff and its officers did not believe in a promenade through France in July 1914, but they were certain that the war could still be won with the greatest effort at that point. 3 years later, victory would be out of question because of the enemy's armaments. While the General Staff's assessments had not yet made an impression on the political leadership, it was now no longer able to ignore the threatening descriptions of the military. Toward the end of the First World War, Bethmann Hollweg therefore had to admit, I quote, "Yes, God, in a certain sense it was a preventive war, but if the war hung over us, if in 2 years it had come much more dangerous and inescapable, and if the military said, no, it is still possible without being defeated, in 2 years it won't be, yes, the military." This illustrates the extent to which politicians have relied on intelligence from the General Staff. Thank you for your attention.